Julian Vance existed as a ghost at the feast of life. On Christmas Eve, the city park was a kaleidoscope of manufactured joy, a whirlwind of red scarves, laughing children, and the crystalline dust of fresh snow falling through the halos of lamplights. He stood apart from it all, a tall, severe silhouette in a dark, tailored overcoat that seemed to absorb the light and warmth around him. He was the CEO of a tech empire that touched millions of lives, yet his own was a landscape of profound, echoing silence. His gaze was fixed on his son, Leo, a small figure in a bright blue snowsuit, the only point of color in Julian's monochrome world. Leo was 5 years old, a vessel of untamed energy and questions that Julian rarely knew how to answer. He watched his son chase a tumbling snowflake, his small, mittened hands reaching for the impossible, and a familiar ache constricted Julian's chest. It was the same ache that lived behind his ribs, a constant dull pressure that had been his companion for 3 years, ever since the world had fractured and Amelia was gone. In Leo's grasp, held tight against his chest, even as he ran, was a small, well-loved teddy bear. Its fur was matted in places, one button eye slightly askew. It was Amelia's last gift to their son. For Julian, that bear was not a toy, it was a relic. It was the softness he could no longer provide, the unconditional comfort he had forgotten how to give. Every time he saw it, he saw Amelia's smile and felt the phantom limb of his old life, a life where he had known how to laugh without it feeling like a betrayal. He drew the cold air into his lungs, the scent of pine and roasting chestnuts turning to ash in his mouth. Around him, families were whole. Fathers lifted their children onto their shoulders, mothers kissed cold noses, and the sound of their happiness was a language Julian no longer spoke. He was an island, and the sea of joy surrounding him only served to erode his shores, leaving him smaller and more isolated with each passing wave. A short distance away, tucked into the relative privacy of a bench beneath the heavy, snow-laden boughs of a great fir tree, sat Clara Maywell. She was a study in quiet melancholy. Her coat was practical but thin, offering little defense against the biting December wind. She held a metal thermos, her fingers wrapped around it not just for warmth, but for something solid to hold on to, in a world that felt increasingly fluid and uncertain. Clara watched the scenes of festive cheer with a deep, wistful longing. She had once loved this time of year. She remembered stringing popcorn with her mother, the scent of her father's pipe tobacco as he read A Christmas Carol aloud. But her parents were long gone, and the recent closure of the community library where she'd worked as a children's librarian had severed her last real connection to a community. She was adrift, a lonely ship in a vast, indifferent ocean, and the cheerful lights of the harbor only reminded her how far she was from any shore. She saw Julian and Leo from a distance. She didn't know who they were, only what they represented. A father and son, a unit, a world unto themselves. She noted the father's rigid posture, the sadness that clung to him like the winter cold. She saw the boy's vibrant energy, a stark contrast to the man's stillness. There was a story there, a sad one, she suspected. It was a sadness she recognized, a kindred spirit in a loneliness she knew all too well. She took a slow sip of her lukewarm tea, the sweetness doing little to combat the bitterness of her solitude. Leo, in his tireless pursuit of the perfect snowflake, finally captured one on the tip of his mitten. He stared at it for a moment, a tiny, intricate star, before it vanished. His quest momentarily complete, his attention drifted. His gaze swept past laughing strangers and landed on the still figure on the bench. He saw Clara. He didn't see a stranger to be avoided. He saw what his father looked like in the quiet moments at home, when Julian thought no one was watching. He saw sad eyes. Without a second thought, unburdened by the rules of adult interaction, Leo changed course. He trotted away from his father, his small boots crunching in the snow, the teddy bear still clutched in his arm. He walked directly toward the bench, his expression one of pure, unfiltered curiosity. Clara was lost in her thoughts when the small boy appeared before her, his head tilted. He stood silently for a moment, just observing her with large, startlingly perceptive brown eyes. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice clear and high in the cold air. The question took her by surprise. In a way, it was the truest thing anyone had said to her in months. She was lost. She managed a small, watery smile. "I don't think so. Are you?" Leo shook his head. "My daddy is over there. He gets lost sometimes, in his head." He held up the teddy bear as if for inspection. "This is Barnaby. He was my mummy's." Just then, Julian noticed Leo's absence. A spike of panic, sharp and cold, shot through him. He scanned the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw him then, standing in front of a woman on a bench, talking as if they were old friends. Julian's instinct was to protect, to shield his son from the world, from strangers, from everything. He started walking briskly toward them, his face a mask of stern concern. Leo saw his father approaching, saw the familiar storm clouds gathering in his expression. He looked from his father's lonely face to the woman's equally lonely one, and in his 5-year-old mind, a perfect, simple, and beautiful solution formed. He turned back to Julian, his face alight with discovery, and pointed a mittened finger at Clara. "Daddy," he shouted, his voice filled with triumphant joy. "I found one. I found a mum for us." The words struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. Mortification washed over him, hot and suffocating. He broke into a near run, reaching the bench in a few long strides. "Leo, no," he managed, his voice tight with embarrassment. He turned to Clara, his face flushed. "I'm so sorry. He doesn't understand. Please forgive him." Clara looked from the horrified father to the hopeful son. She could have been offended, she could have been angry or unnerved, but she wasn't. In the child's impossible declaration, she heard not a demand, but a plea. It was the sound of a little boy trying to mend a broken world with the only tools he had. She saw the raw pain in Julian's eyes, the desperate attempt to hold himself together, and her heart, which had felt so cold and empty, felt a flicker of warmth. She offered Julian a gentle, reassuring smile. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft. "He has a very kind heart." She looked down at Leo, who was now gazing up at his father, his hopeful expression beginning to falter. "And a very good imagination." The moment hung between the three of them, fragile and strange. Julian's apology died on his lips, disarmed by her unexpected grace. He had expected a harsh word, a hasty retreat. He had not expected to be met with understanding. He looked at her properly for the first time, truly saw her. The weariness in her eyes, but also a deep well of kindness. Leo, sensing the shift in tension, pressed his advantage. "She's cold, Daddy," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Her hands are sad." He pointed to where her fingers were wrapped tightly around the thermos. "We should get her hot chocolate, the kind with marshmallows." Julian felt trapped, his social conditioning, his grief, his fierce desire for privacy. It all screamed at him to make his excuses and leave. But he couldn't. He couldn't refuse the simple, earnest request of his son, not when it was the most engaged he had seen him all day, and he couldn't bring himself to walk away from the quiet dignity of the woman Leo had so brazenly tried to adopt. He cleared his throat, the sound awkward in the winter air. "He's right," Julian said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "It is cold. Would you allow us to buy you a hot chocolate? As an apology for my son's enthusiasm." Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to decline, to retreat back into her safe, lonely world. But then she looked at Leo's face, shining with hope, and at Julian's, so full of conflict and weariness. She felt a pull, a strange sense of belonging in this accidental, temporary trio. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. The cafe was an oasis of warmth and light. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, steamed milk, and melting chocolate. It was a world away from the cold park and the performative cheer that felt so isolating. Julian found them a secluded booth in the back, a small pocket of privacy in the bustling room. The contrast was immediate and profound. Outside was the vast, cold emptiness of their separate lives, but inside this small space there was a shared, fragile warmth. Leo, delighted, slid into the booth and immediately began chattering about the different kinds of sprinkles he could see behind the counter. Julian helped Clara out of her thin coat, his movements stiff and formal. For a moment his fingers brushed against hers, and the brief contact was like a small electric shock, a reminder of a human connection he had long avoided. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if burned. He ordered 2 hot chocolates with extra marshmallows for Leo and Clara, and a black coffee for himself. As they waited, a thick silence descended, broken only by Leo's happy humming. Julian gripped his coffee cup, his knuckles white. He didn't know what to say. Small talk felt trivial, and real talk was a territory he had abandoned years ago. Clara, sensing his discomfort, decided to speak first. "Barnaby is a very handsome bear," she said, nodding toward the toy sitting on the table. Leo beamed. "My mommy gave him to me. She's a star now. Daddy said so. She watches over us from very, very high up." Julian's breath hitched. He stared down into his coffee, the black liquid a reflection of the void he felt inside. He braced himself for the inevitable awkward condolences, the pitying looks he so despised. But Clara didn't offer pity. She simply looked at Leo with a gentle expression. "That must make you feel very safe," she said, "to have your own special star." Her response was so simple, so perfect, that Julian looked up, surprised. She wasn't treating Leo's statement as a fantasy to be managed, but as a truth to be honored. She was speaking Leo's language. "He misses her," Julian said, the admission quiet and raw, "especially this time of year." "The world can feel very loud and bright when you're missing someone," Clara replied, her gaze soft and understanding. "It makes the quiet places inside you feel even quieter." In that moment, Julian felt seen. She hadn't just heard his words. She had understood the space between them. She understood the specific loneliness of grieving amidst celebration. He felt a crack form in the icy wall he had built around his heart, a tiny fissure through which a sliver of warmth was beginning to seep. They didn't speak of their own deep pains, not yet, but they touched upon the edges of them. Clara mentioned the library, how much she missed the children and the smell of old paper. Julian talked about how Leo loved bedtime stories, but how his own voice always felt flat and lifeless when he read them. They were small confessions, tiny offerings of vulnerability, placed carefully on the table between them, next to the cooling drinks and the worn teddy bear. That single encounter on Christmas Eve should have been the end of it, a strange, sweet, and melancholic memory to be filed away. But Leo wouldn't allow it. For the next few days, he spoke of nothing but the lady from the park. He asked when they would see her again, if she could read him a story, if her hands were still sad. Julian found himself haunted by the memory of her kind eyes and her quiet understanding. He was a man who solved problems with logic and resources. Leo was sad. Clara had a unique ability to soothe that sadness. The solution, from a purely logical standpoint, was simple. He used his vast network to find her, a task that took his highly efficient assistant less than an hour. He learned of her situation. The library, her small apartment, her lack of family. He called her. The conversation was stilted, awkward. He proposed a job. He framed it as a business transaction, a position as a private storyteller and companion for Leo. He offered a salary that was more than she had made in a year at the library, hoping the sheer size of the offer would override any hesitation. He was buying her time, her kindness, her warmth. It felt crass, but it was the only way he knew how to ask for what Leo so desperately needed. Clara was hesitant. She didn't want to be a charity case, a project for a wealthy, grieving man. But then she thought of Leo's bright, searching eyes, She thought of the profound loneliness she felt in her tiny apartment. This wasn't just about money. It was about connection. It was about a little boy who needed stories and a woman who had stories to give. She accepted. Her arrival at Julian's house was a study in contrasts. The mansion was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all glass, steel, and stark white walls. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was less a home than a museum, showcasing a life of success, but not happiness. Clara, with her warm smile and her simple, colourful scarf, was like the first flower, pushing through a frozen landscape. Slowly, tentatively, she began to fill the silence of that house, her voice animated and full of character as she read stories to Leo in his sprawling playroom, echoed through the empty halls. The scent of freshly baked cookies, a simple batch of chocolate chip she made with Leo one afternoon, began to war with the sterile, scentless air. She brought small, gentle changes: a vase of bright yellow tulips on a cold marble countertop, a soft blanket draped over a severe leather sofa. Julian kept his distance at first. He would watch them from the doorway of his study, observing Clara and Leo as they built block towers or painted messy watercolors. He saw the easy way she had with his son, the genuine laughter she drew from him. He saw Leo flourish under her gentle attention, the shadows in his eyes receding day by day. He found himself looking forward to the quiet evenings after Leo was asleep. He and Clara would sit in the vast, formal living room, a fireplace crackling between them, and share a cup of tea. Their conversations deepened, moving from the safe territory of Leo's day to the more treacherous ground of their own lives. One night, a melancholic piano piece began to play softly from a smart speaker in the corner. It was a piece Amelia had loved, one they had danced to in this very room years ago, back when it was filled with warmth and life. Julian froze, the teacup halfway to his lips. The music unlocked a door inside him he had kept bolted for 3 years, and the grief poured out. "That was her favorite," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Amelia's." Clara said nothing. She simply sat with him in the silence, her presence a quiet anchor in his sudden, violent storm of memory. And then he began to talk. He told her everything. He spoke of the rainy night, the slick road, the screech of tires. He confessed the bottomless guilt he felt for being the one who was driving, the one who had walked away with only scratches, while Amelia. He talked about the hollowness of his success, how every achievement felt like a monument to his failure as a husband. He confessed his deepest fear, that the grief had frozen his heart, that he was incapable of being the father Leo deserved, that he was just a hollow man in a hollow house. He laid his broken pieces before her, expecting her to recoil. Instead, she listened. She listened with an empathy that was so profound it felt like a physical comfort, a warm hand on his shivering soul. When he was finished, his voice raw and his eyes wet, she finally spoke. "You are not a hollow man, Julian," she said softly. "You are a man full of love for your wife and your son. The love is so big, it hurts. That's not emptiness. That's a heart that is still very much alive." She then shared a piece of her own story, of watching her parents fade, of the crushing loneliness that followed, the feeling of being the last one left. It wasn't a competition of pain, but a communion of it. In that shared vulnerability, under the soft glow of the firelight, the fragile connection that had formed in the cafe began to weave itself into something strong, something that looked almost like hope. The next morning, Leo came running to them, a piece of paper clutched in his hand. It was a child's drawing, rendered in bright, waxy crayon. There were 3 stick figures, a tall one labeled Daddy, a smaller one labeled Leo, and a figure with long brown hair standing between them, labeled Clara. Over their heads he had drawn a big, smiling sun. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, he had written, "My family." Leo looked from Julian to Clara, his expression serious. "Will you stay for all the Christmases?" he asked her. "Forever?" Clara looked at Julian, her heart aching with a mix of joy and uncertainty. Julian looked at the drawing, at the simple, perfect world his son had created. For the first time in years, he didn't just see what he had lost. He saw what he could have. He saw a future. He reached out and gently took Clara's hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "She'll stay." The annual Vance Corporation Christmas Gala was the glittering pinnacle of the city's social calendar. For years, Julian had attended out of obligation, a spectre moving through the crowds, his smile a carefully constructed mask. This year was different. This year, he wanted to go. He wanted to stand in a room full of people with Clara by his side. It felt like a declaration, a step out of the shadows and back into the light. Clara was hesitant, daunted by the prospect of his world of wealth and power, but Julian was gently insistent. He bought her a dress, a simple, elegant gown of deep emerald velvet that brought out the warmth in her eyes. When she came down the grand staircase of his home, he felt his breath catch in his throat. She was beautiful, but more than that, she radiated a quiet confidence and grace that made the cavernous house feel like a home. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of genuine happiness, a warmth that had nothing to do with memory or nostalgia, but was rooted firmly in the present. The ballroom was a sea of jewels and forced smiles. Julian guided Clara through the crowd, his hand resting possessively in the small of her back. He felt the curious stares, heard the whispered questions. He ignored them. For the first hour, they existed in a small bubble of their own making, talking quietly, sharing a glass of champagne, finding a strange intimacy amidst the chaos. The bubble was burst by a woman named Julian Vance, a distant cousin of Julian's, who had always worn her envy of Amelia like a second skin. She approached them with a predatory smile, her eyes flicking over Clara with undisguised disdain. "Julian, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How wonderful to see you looking so cheerful." Her gaze lingered on Clara. "And you've brought a guest?" "How lovely." Julian's back stiffened. "Eleanor, this is Clara Maywell." Eleanor's smile tightened. "Of course, the new nanny." The word was laced with poison. She then turned her full attention to Julian, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper loud enough for Clara to hear perfectly. "I must say, you're moving on quickly. I'm sure Amelia would be surprised to see her son's caregiver in her place so soon." The words were a stiletto blade, slid expertly between his ribs. Every insecurity, every ounce of guilt Julian had carried for 3 years, rushed to the surface. He looked at Clara, standing there in the beautiful dress he had bought her, and suddenly saw the situation through Eleanor's cruel eyes. Was that what this was? Was he just trying to replace Amelia? Was he using Clara, this kind, gentle woman, to fill a void that should have remained sacred? The fear that he was betraying his late wife, that his newfound happiness was a desecration of her memory, was a cold, suffocating wave. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a familiar, glacial distance. The hand on Clara's back felt heavy. Then it was gone completely. He muttered a curt excuse to Eleanor and steered Clara toward the exit, his grip on her arm now painfully tight. The drive home was a descent into a thick, unbearable silence. The music from the radio felt intrusive, the city lights garish. When they reached the house, he walked her to the door, but he didn't go in. He stood on the cold stone steps, a chasm of unspoken words between them. "Julian, what's wrong?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. "This was a mistake," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. He wouldn't look at her. "All of it. The party. Us. I'm not ready." The words were a lie, but they were a shield. He was pushing her away to protect himself from the agony of his own guilt, to protect Amelia's memory from what he now saw as his own weakness. He believed, in that moment of panicked grief, that he was also protecting Clara from a man who was too broken to love her properly. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Every fear she had harbored that she was just a placeholder, a temporary comfort, a glorified employee, crashed down on her. The warmth and hope of the past few weeks felt like a cruel illusion. She had allowed herself to believe in a future, and now it was being snatched away with a few cold, dismissive words. "I see," she whispered, though she didn't see at all. She saw only the return of the cold, guarded man she had first met in the park. The man who had started to thaw was gone, encased in ice once more. She turned, without another word, and walked away, the sound of her heels on the pavement echoing the shattering of her heart. Julian didn't move. He just stood there in the cold, watching her disappear into the night, convinced he had done the only honorable thing. He had chosen grief. He had chosen the past. The house was silent again. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, far worse than before, because now Julian knew what he was missing. Clara's scent no longer lingered in the air, the tulips on the counter had begun to wilt, and the blanket on the sofa looked like a sad, discarded thing. Leo felt the change immediately. The light in the house had gone out. He became quiet, withdrawn. He stopped asking for stories. He simply sat in his room, clutching Barnaby the bear, his small face a mask of confusion and sorrow. A few nights later, Julian was in his study, staring at a photograph of Amelia on his desk, trying to find justification for his actions in her smiling face. He was drowning in his own self-imposed misery, a martyr to a memory. The door creaked open, and Leo padded in, his small feet silent on the thick rug. He was holding the crayon drawing he had made. The paper, now slightly crumpled. He held it out to Julian. "You forgot this, Daddy," he said, his voice small but clear. "You forgot Clara." Julian looked at the drawing of the 3 smiling stick figures under the happy sun. It felt like a relic from another lifetime. "Clara's gone, Leo," he said, his voice rough. Leo shook his head, a stubborn set to his small jaw. "No, you pushed her away. Because you were scared." The childishly simple observation was more cutting than any adult accusation could have been. "Mommy told me in a dream," he continued, his eyes wide and serious. "She said the stars are happy when you're happy. She said she wants you to laugh again. She said Clara helps you find the laughs." Julian stared at his son, at the profound, unshakable truth in his eyes. The dam of his carefully constructed logic, his guilt, his fear, it all broke. Leo wasn't just talking about a dream. He was giving him permission. He was channeling the very love that Julian thought he was protecting. He was showing him that true love doesn't demand sorrow as a tribute. It desires happiness for those left behind. The realization struck him with the force of a physical revelation. He hadn't been honoring Amelia. He had been using her memory as an excuse to stay in his safe, familiar prison of grief. He had allowed a cruel woman's casual venom to poison the most beautiful thing that had happened to him in years. He had panicked, and in his panic he was about to lose everything that mattered. He was losing Clara. He was failing his son. He looked down at the crumpled drawing in his hand, the smiling stick figures, his family, his future. He knew, with an absolute certainty, that quieted the chaos in his soul, what he had to do. He had to fight for it. He scooped Leo into his arms, holding him tight. "You're right," he whispered into his son's hair. "You're so right. Daddy made a mistake. A very big mistake." Clara's small apartment was filled with cardboard boxes. Each object she packed, a book, a photograph, a small ceramic bird, felt like a piece of a life she was leaving behind. She had decided to move, to go somewhere new, where the memories weren't so sharp. Staying in the city, so close to the life she had briefly touched, was an agony she couldn't bear. She worked mechanically, her movements fueled by a numb, quiet heartbreak. A frantic, insistent knocking at her door startled her. It was nearly midnight. Her first instinct was fear, but it was quickly replaced by a wild, illogical flicker of hope that she immediately tried to extinguish. She opened the door. Just a crack. It was Julian. He looked undone. His hair was disheveled, his overcoat was unbuttoned, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, raw emotion she had never seen before. He wasn't the cold CEO or the guarded widower. He was just a man, standing on her doorstep, looking completely and utterly lost. "Clara," he breathed, his voice ragged. "Thank God." He saw the boxes behind her, and a look of sheer panic crossed his face. "No, please, don't go." Before she could speak, he began to talk, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of confession and regret. "I was a fool, a coward. What I said, it was a lie. I was scared. Someone said something cruel, and it hit this button inside me, this deep fear that I was betraying her, that I didn't deserve to be happy again. And I reacted. I pushed you away because it was easier than facing that fear. It was the biggest mistake of my life." He took a step closer, his eyes pleading with her. "These past few weeks, you haven't been filling a void, Clara. You've been creating something new. You didn't replace the light that went out. You brought your own. You walked into my silent, empty life, and you filled it with warmth and stories and the smell of cookies. You taught my son how to laugh again. You taught me how to breathe again." He reached out, his hands gently taking hers. They were cold. "I'm not just ready for a future, Clara. I don't have one without you. Leo and we're lost without you. Please," his voice broke, thick with emotion. "Please come home." Tears streamed down Clara's face, washing away the numbness, the sorrow. They were tears of relief, of disbelief, of a hope she thought had been extinguished forever. She saw the truth in his eyes, the profound sincerity in his desperate plea. He wasn't offering her a job or a temporary position. He was offering her his heart, broken and scared as it was. "Yes," she whispered, the word a quiet affirmation in the late-night stillness of the hallway. "Yes." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let go. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent, a scent he now knew was the scent of home. In the warm circle of his embrace, surrounded by the boxes of a life she no longer had to leave, Clara finally felt like she had arrived. 1 year later, Christmas Eve found them back in the same city park. The snow was falling again, thick, silent flakes, dusting the world in a blanket of pure white. The same festive lights twinkled in the trees. The same sound of distant carols hung in the air. The setting was identical, but the scene was transformed. Julian was no longer a solitary figure on the edge of the joy. He was in the very heart of it. He stood with Clara, his arm wrapped securely around her, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder. His other hand was holding Leo's, and together they swung the giggling 5-year-old between them, his small boots kicking up sprays of fresh snow. The severe lines of Julian's face had softened over the past year. The haunted, distant look in his eyes had been replaced by a warm, present light. He laughed, a real, deep laugh that reached his eyes as Leo begged to be swung higher. He was no longer the wounded executive, a ghost at the feast. He was a man who was fully, vibrantly alive. He was a father. He was a partner. Their house was no longer a sterile museum. It was a home, a towering Christmas tree, decorated with a chaotic mix of elegant glass ornaments, and Leo's handmade creations stood in the living room. The air was rich with the scent of pine and gingerbread. Books were stacked on tables, colorful paintings were stuck to the refrigerator, and the lingering sound of laughter seemed to have permanently settled in its walls. They stopped near the bench, the very one where Clara had sat, so alone, 1 year ago. It was empty now, covered in a pristine layer of snow. It no longer looked like a place of solitude, but like a quiet monument to a beginning. Julian turned to Clara, his expression full of a love so profound it needed no words. He gently brushed a snowflake from her cheek. "A year ago, on this spot, my son found a mom," he said, his voice soft. "But I think we all found what we were looking for. We were 3 lonely people, lost in our own quiet ways." Clara leaned in and kissed him, a kiss full of warmth and promise, a stark contrast to the cold air around them. "And now we're found," she whispered against his lips. Leo, tugging on their hands, pointed up at the darkening sky. A single, bright star had appeared, twinkling through a break in the clouds. "Look," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Mommy's watching." She's smiling." Julian looked up at the star, and for the first time, he felt no pain, no guilt, only a quiet, peaceful gratitude. He squeezed Clara's hand, then bent down and lifted Leo into his arms. The three of them stood together. A small, tight circle of warmth against the winter cold, their shadows merging into one under the gentle glow of the park lamps. They were not a replacement for a family that was lost. They were a new family, forged in shared sorrow, built on a child's innocent hope, and cemented by a love that was brave enough to choose a new beginning. They were, finally and completely, home.